In 1991, I moved to South Africa to get involved in the anti-apartheid movement's transition to democracy. As a geek, I played a small role in helping organizations get access to email. Back then, email could slip across borders in a way that activists couldn't. With Mandela's election in 1994 came a sense that anything was possible. And it didn't seem like a coincidence that that was the first year in which the internet showed real signs of growth in Africa. The idea that affordable access to communication could unleash potential on the continent got hold of me then and hasn't let go. But unfortunately, in 1994, the internet was largely connected via telephone lines. And at that time, there were more phone lines in New York City than in the whole of Africa. Worse, while many countries were connected via undersea cables, African countries were limited to slower and much more expensive satellite connections. So what I love most about the internet is the fact that if you can build an on-ramp to the internet, you can be part of it, no matter where you are. And that's how the internet got started in virtually every country in Africa, by a pioneer who saw the opportunity, who made that bridge and overcame the obstacles to connecting. And often that was as simple as 2 modems and an international telephone line. But scaling those connections has proved challenging. I spent a number of years working for a Canadian research funding agency, trying to unpack the problems of making internet solutions work in areas without sufficient power, connectivity, or the economic means to sustain access. And I was so wrapped up in the internet that for a number of years I didn't acknowledge mobile telephony. It seemed inconceivable to me that a mobile phone could be a tool for empowerment. And of course, they were never originally intended that way. Yet mobile telephony has spread further and faster in Africa than anyone would have believed possible. To the point that now, 2/3 of the population of sub-Saharan Africa has access to a mobile phone signal, and about 1/5 have access to 3G or better data services. It's easier to make a payment with your phone in Africa than it is in North America or Europe. Thanks to systems like M-Pesa, African telecom operators lead the world in mobile innovation. So while legacy networks based on copper wires are still common in what we call the developed world, wireless is the standard in Africa. But there's still a long way to go. With the success of mobile networks, African telecom operators are requesting access to more radio frequencies to build higher capacity networks. And doubtless, that's the right thing to do, but it may not be the only thing to do. It's worth scratching beneath the surface of what radio spectrum and spectrum management is to better understand the possibilities. Now, when I say management and spectrum, it makes spectrum sound like a thing, but of course it's not. It's simply the range of possible frequencies for wireless communication. And unpacking something as intangible as that can be tricky. But some things are clear. So one is why spectrum needs management, and it's simply to prevent the interference among radio signals. And in order to achieve that, historically, spectrum has been parceled out in individual chunks for services like satellite, radar, mobile, radio, TV, etc. Like this spectrum allocation chart from the Mauritian communication regulator. And organizations that receive spectrum are typically granted exclusivity over that spectrum, often for 10 to 15 years. And now that demand exceeds the availability of spectrum, they're often paying significant sums of money for those spectrum licenses, raising issues of power, influence, and ultimately the cost to the consumer. So spectrum management is becoming a bit of a bottleneck to affordable access. In order to illustrate this, I want you to imagine a hotel in which rooms are rented out for 10 to 15 years at a time, whether they're occupied or not, and that where some rooms are just kept empty to make sure that paying guests are never disturbed by noisy neighbors. Now, that's not a perfect analogy for how spectrum management works, but it does illustrate some key inefficiencies, such as the way that chunks of spectrum between assigned frequencies are kept empty for what are now essentially historical reasons. So we have this ironic situation where the cost of a room at the Spectrum Hotel is going through the roof, yet some rooms are kept empty. Happily, technology is bringing a new approach to spectrum management, one in which the assignment of spectrum is managed by hardware and software, and spectrum is given out on an as-needed basis. This is called television white spaces spectrum, and or now more generically, simply dynamic spectrum. And the biggest opportunity at the moment is in the television broadcast frequencies for dynamic spectrum. And this is great news for sub-Saharan Africa, where those television frequencies are typically sparsely occupied. And it happens that television broadcast frequencies are also great for rural access, where affordable solutions are most needed. And before we leave the wireless hotel, there's one more room I want to tell you about. It's kind of like a bar or a speakeasy at the back of the hotel, a place where everyone's welcome and there's no charge for entry. As word is spread about this hotel, about this room, it's become more and more popular, until now it's packed out day and night. Of course, what I'm talking about is the realm of spectrum designated for unlicensed use. That is, approved technologies that don't require a spectrum license to operate. The anyone-can-play nature of Wi-Fi technologies is a very powerful concept. Wi-Fi has gone from a technology for scientists and geeks to being embedded in everything from phones to fridges to light bulbs to thermostats. It is literally the lingua franca of devices. But what interests me most about Wi-Fi is its role in the growth of smartphone use. Consider these figures. This graph is based on research data from Mobidia, and it profiles smartphone data use over the last 18 months from over 70 countries. And what you can see is not only is Wi-Fi increasing as a proportion of the total smartphone data use, but now over 80% of smartphone data goes over Wi-Fi. This means that that little room at the back of the Spectrum Hotel is carrying more data than all of the licensed mobile rooms combined. It makes me think we should call them Wi-Fi phones instead of mobile phones. At the very least, it tells us that mobile networks and mobile devices require independent consideration. So, dynamic spectrum, unlicensed spectrum, but those are not the only reasons that make me think that the future of access in Africa may not look like a simple multiplication of mobile networks. One of the biggest changes to come to the continent in the last 5 years has been the explosion of undersea fiber optic cable capacity. In the last 5 years, more than 10 undersea cables have landed on the shores of sub-Saharan African countries, bringing with it terabits of capacity. In terms of international access, African countries are global players now. I first started mapping undersea cables 5 years ago, and I would never have predicted just how fast and how profound the change has been. And it hasn't stopped there. All this capacity coming to the shores of African countries has sparked a tsunami of investment in terrestrial fiber optic infrastructure, with the impact that in the near future, all primary and secondary cities in Africa are likely to have access to fiber. And this changes things. Previously, if you wanted to build a communication network, you had to be responsible for the entire food chain of it. The international connection, national backhaul networks, local access networks, and the device. Now, with fiber coming to primary and secondary cities, and with low-cost technologies like Wi-Fi and dynamic spectrum, the opportunity for people to begin to build their own communication networks emerges. William Gibson famously said, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. What I'd like to give you is some examples of what I think the future of access in Africa looks like. So this is Emmanuel Togo. He's the senior network engineer at the University of Ghana, Legon in Accra. UG Legon's the biggest university in Ghana, about 40,000 students and a campus the size of a small town. Now, with a campus fiber backbone connected to an undersea cable and about 200 Wi-Fi access points costing less than $100 each, he was able to build a wireless campus network serving the entire student body, with the impact that pressure on overcrowded student labs dropped, that the uptake of laptops by students went up dramatically as students wanted to take advantage of access to this network, and even mobile costs for students dropped as they instantly switched over to Wi-Fi when they came on campus. Now, this is a story about a university campus, but is one that could be told about any town that had access to fiber. And moving beyond Wi-Fi, this is Dr. Chimora Makeka. He's a professor of physics at the University of Malawi in Zomba. Zomba's on a plateau in the middle of Malawi, and while there's 3G access in the urban center of Zomba, it quickly drops off to slower access in rural areas. Chimora saw the opportunity, the necessity of providing broadband to key rural institutions. And using dynamic spectrum technologies, he built an affordable rural broadband network covering tens of kilometers, connecting hospitals, school, research institutions, and others. This is the tip of the iceberg in terms of what can be achieved with dynamic spectrum technology as manufacturing begins to scale up for it. And low-cost wireless has also become a platform for innovation in manufacturing as well. So in Kenya, TED fellows Juliana Rotich and Eric Herzman and their team have created the BRIC, which is a Wi-Fi device designed to address specifically African connectivity challenges. Now, integrating Wi-Fi and mobile in a single device together with a battery backup, they've built something that can roll smoothly over the speed bumps of power and connectivity interruptions. Like another Kenyan innovation, M-Pesa, BRIC challenges the idea that technological solutions need to come from outside Africa. And in South Africa, with help from the Shuttleworth Foundation, I founded Village Telco, where we created a device that integrated a rugged Wi-Fi mesh device with voice services. We call it the mesh potato. And it can be used anywhere to deploy low-cost voice and data networks. Operating together, the mesh potatoes form a cloud, self-healing, self-organizing cloud of connectivity and telephony. Such as here in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, where Carlos Ray from the University of the Western Cape is working with local communities and Village Telco technology to build their own voice and data network in a place that has mobile access, but which is relatively unaffordable for rural poor communities. Even more interesting, they've used cooperative legislation to create their own telecommunications cooperative to manage their resources and their own network. The South African communications regulator has recently recognized the ZENZELENI Telecommunications Cooperative as a legitimate service provider in the area. So as the individual and collective value of being connected goes steadily up and up, the opportunity cost for those without access rises commensurately. Ensuring that everyone has affordable access to communication thus becomes an issue that becomes more critical with each passing day. What excites me most about where we are now is that increasingly we don't have to wait for someone to come and build us an on-ramp to the internet. We can do it ourselves. Access is opening up to an entire continent of pioneers, people like Emmanuel, Chimora, Juliana, Eric, Carlos, and others. What is needed, though, is for policymakers and regulators to embrace the strategic importance of unlicensed and dynamic spectrum and lower the barriers to access innovation. Healthy markets have always had room for tiny, smart, hungry pioneers to grow. Unlicensed spectrum and dynamic spectrum is a door to a world in which access entrepreneurs in Africa and around the world can grow and flourish. Thank you.